Hello, I'm Andy Mack, and welcome to a very special edition of Movie Shorts. Today's episode isn't a review, there's no score, no spoiler warning, and no should you see it, because we're going back to the future. It's been 40 years since the film first hit cinemas, and instead of revisiting it like any other release, I want to explore why it worked, not just in terms of plot or character, but in the way it captured a cultural moment, and why it still resonates decades later. Now, I've always loved this film, but my connection goes a bit deeper. Back at university, I wrote an essay on postmodernism in Back to the Future. I didn't know it at the time, but I was laying the groundwork for a fascination that stuck with me ever since. I was drawn to how the film juggled irony and nostalgia, how it celebrated the past while subtly critiquing it, and how it used time travel as a way of rewriting personal history and playing with pop culture memory. This episode is part documentary, part conversation, not about what happens in the film, but also about how and why it connected. We'll look at the production process, the writing, and the influences that shaped it. We'll explore what was going on politically and culturally in 1985 and why audiences were ready to revisit the 1950s with such fondness. We'll talk about how Back to the Future fit into the broader wave of 1980s cinema and what it tells us about the rise of technology, youth identity, and family dynamics. And we'll ask the question, would Back to the Future work if it were pitched today? Don't worry, things won't get too heavy. If you grew up in the 1980s or 90s like me, there's a good chance this film means something to you. So whether you're here for the nostalgia, the craft, or the cultural context, buckle up because we're going, well, you know the line. And just before the lightning strikes the clock tower, let's get straight to it. So, if you ever want a masterclass in screenwriting, just look at the Back to the Future script. It's often used in film schools for good reason. The setup and the payoff are razor sharp. Every detail introduced early on, the skateboard, the clock tower flyer, the "you're just too darn loud" audition, loops back in with purpose. There's almost no wasted line or beat. The structure follows a classic 3-act arc, but with an added time loop. The stakes feel personal, not world-ending. Marty just wants to get home and make sure he still exists. The genius is in how small the goal is, yet how massive the emotional consequences are. And let's talk about the characters. Marty McFly isn't a superhero, but he's cool, relatable, and just clumsy enough to root for. He's the perfect bridge between the audience and this surreal situation. Doc Brown, on the other hand, is chaotic but brilliant, the kind of mentor figure who doesn't just explain the rules of time travel, gives the film its manic energy. And then there's George and Lorraine, not just comic relief, but complex characters in their own right. George's arc especially is the emotional backbone of the story. You cheer when he finally stands up to Biff, not because it's a win, but because you've seen how hard it was for him to get there. And speaking of Biff, what a baddie. Thomas F. Wilson plays him with such brute force and dumb confidence that he becomes the perfect foil. He's physically bigger, louder, and more threatening than Marty in every way. You feel the size difference, especially in the 1955 scenes. It's a classic underdog setup, visually and emotionally. Even the car was perfectly cast. A time machine could have been anything, but Zemeckis and Gale chose a DeLorean, all stainless steel angles and gull-wing doors, because it looked futuristic, but totally impractical. It turned a throwaway gag about blending in into an iconic image. The moment you see it pull out of Doc's truck, the film's tone locks in. Sleek, strange, and slightly ridiculous in the best way. Casting plays a huge role into why films worked, and this is no exception. Michael J. Fox wasn't the original choice. They'd shot weeks of footage with Eric Stoltz before realizing the tone was all wrong. Fox brought humor, charm, and an everyman quality that grounded the film's most outrageous elements. Add to that Alan Silvestri's soaring score, Huey Lewis and the News locking in that pop sensibility, and Robert Zemeckis' confident direction, and you've got a film that doesn't just hit beats, it generates 1.21 gigawatts of charm. It's fast, it's funny, and never outstays its welcome. No wonder audiences in 1985 kept coming back to see it again and again. Because when every part of a movie clicks like this, you don't just watch it, you remember it. Back to the Future didn't come out of nowhere. It arrived in the middle of a blockbuster revolution that had been reshaping Hollywood since the late 1970s. A movement driven by spectacle, heart, and a new kind of cinematic wonder. At the center of it all, Steven Spielberg and George Lucas. Star Wars 1977 had already proved that audiences would flock to a mythic high-concept storytelling. Raiders of the Lost Ark in 1981 showed that you could mix breakneck action with humor and heart. And E.T. 1982 reminded studios that emotional storytelling, even with sci-fi packaging, could be a cultural juggernaut. Back to the Future stands comfortably in that lineage. Spielberg didn't direct it, but his fingerprints are all over it, as executive producer, creative sounding board, and the one who gave Robert Zemeckis the green light when other studios passed. In fact, Universal only agreed to back the project because Spielberg's name was attached. What these earlier films proved, and what Back to the Future inherited, was that genre didn't need to be limiting. You could blend sci-fi, comedy, teen drama, and even light horror, and audiences would embrace it if the story had heart. Zemeckis and co-writer Bob Gale were working within that same spirit of mash-up confidence, not parodying the past, but celebrating it with self-awareness and style. There's also a generational thread running through these films. Star Wars was about destiny and legacy. Indiana Jones was about facing the past, often literally, with ancient relics and historical baggage. And Back to the Future took those themes and shrunk them down to a family level. Forget empires and holy grails. Here, the stakes are your mum falling for you and your dad learning to throw a punch. And all of it held together by Doc Brown, a character who doesn't just explain the science, but injects it with urgency. His wide-eyed panic, precise planning, and sense of everything almost falling apart adds genuine tension. He's the one who makes you believe time travel is possible, and that missing a lightning bolt by 1 second could unravel everything. The world that allowed Back to the Future to exist had been built by the giants that came before it. Without the trust audiences had in genre films, and without the creative environment that Spielberg and Lucas had fostered, a film as weird, ambitious, and genre-bending as this one might never have left the driveway. By the early 1980s, the United States was still nursing a kind of cultural bruise. The Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, economic instability. The 1970s had left the national mood raw and uncertain. There was a lingering sense that the American dream had cracked a little. So, when the blockbuster era hit its stride, it didn't just bring spectacle, it brought escape. Just look at the biggest box office hits leading up to 1985. Star Wars in 1977 took audiences to a galaxy far, far away, a place where good and evil were clear and rebellion had purpose. Raiders of the Lost Ark 1981 hurled them back to the 1930s in a pulpy, globe-trotting adventure, eventually helping to overcome the Nazis, a war that America had won. Grease 1978 offered a candy-coated vision of the 1950s where teenage rebellion was all about leather jackets and dance-offs. These films didn't reflect the present, they avoided it. And that avoidance worked. Audiences were done with moral ambiguity and messy realism. They wanted to feel good again. The shift was also a pivot away from the dominant tone of 1970s cinema. The decade had been defined by gritty realism, fractured narratives, and morally complex characters. Think Taxi Driver, The Godfather, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Apocalypse Now. These were masterful films, but heavy ones. As the cultural fog lifted and the 1980s dawned, audiences were ready for something brighter, lighter, more fun. The pendulum swung from rumination to escapism, and Hollywood followed. That appetite synced perfectly with the political mood of the day. Ronald Reagan was in the White House selling a version of America that was bright, bold, and reassuring. His speeches were filled with throwbacks to traditional values and simpler times. In that sense, Back to the Future wasn't just a crowd pleaser, it was spiritually aligned with the culture. It offered the ultimate Reagan-era fantasy. What if we could go back, fix the past, and return to the present with everything improved? The choice was to set half the film in 1955 was more than stylistic, it was strategic. In Reagan's America, the 1950s weren't just history, they were mythology. It was the golden age of diners, drive-ins, and nuclear families. And in Back to the Future, that idolized past gets lovingly recreated, but also gently integrated. Because the 1955 Hill Valley isn't perfect. There's bullying, rigid gender roles, and an undercurrent of repression. Marty, with a 1980s swagger, skateboard, and portable music, crashes into the world like a cultural shockwave. He's out of sync, but he's also ahead of the curve. He disrupts expectation, calls out injustice, and quite literally changes the trajectory of his own family. Even Reagan himself was reportedly a fan. When Doc scoffs at the idea of a movie star president, he wasn't joking. Tell me, future boy, who's president of the United States in 1985? Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, the actor? Then who's vice president? Jerry Lewis? I suppose Jane Wyman is the first lady, and Jack Benny is secretary of the Treasury. It's one of the funniest moments in the whole film, and such a perfect cultural clash. You can feel the disbelief from 1955 crashing into the absurdity of the future, and the fact that Reagan himself reportedly loved the line, even had it rewound at a White House screening. That just seals it. Back to the Future didn't just reference history, it got pulled into it. The 1980s weren't just about looking back. They were also obsessed with what was coming next. And in 1985, the future felt closer than ever. Technology was exploding. Home computers were starting to appear in middle-class homes. Video game arcades were packed. VHS players were turning living rooms into cinemas. Kids had Walkmans glued to their ears, and tech wasn't just functional, it was personal. Suddenly your gadget said something about you. Back to the Future tapped directly into that energy. Marty McFly is, in many ways, a product of the 1980s future. He moves fast, thinks fast, records everything, and carries his music on his hip. When he travels back to 1955, it's not just time that separates him from everyone else. It's culture, attitude, and tech. He literally has to explain what a camcorder is. And then there's the DeLorean, a time machine built out of a stainless steel sports car with gull wing doors. It's impractical, it's over-designed, and it's perfect. It felt futuristic in a way only the 1980s could get away with. Cool, sleek, and loud. But here's the irony. The real DeLorean was kind of a disaster. It was underpowered, overpriced, and plagued by production issues. And it wasn't made in Detroit or California. It was built in Northern Ireland, in a factory outside Belfast during the height of the Troubles. While the car on screen screamed American future, the reality was far messier. And yet, once it rolls out of Doc Brown's truck, it looks like something from a dream and a music video at the same time. It's no accident that audiences loved it, or that it still looks iconic today. Sometimes the idea of something is more powerful than the thing itself. But it wasn't just technology that defined the moment. It was choice. Cable TV was exploding, offering viewers more channels than ever before. MTV had launched in 1981 and changed how young people consumed music and style. Malls became temples of personal branding. You could curate your tastes, music, clothes, movies, and express who you were like never before. That cultural shift shows up in Marty's look and lifestyle. He's not a generic everyman, he's a specific teenager. His vest, his skateboard, his music, it's all curated. It's not just reacting to the world, he's broadcasting himself into it. Back to the Future didn't just capture 1985, it crystallized it. It showed us a kid from a plugged-in, hyper-consumer world crashing into a black and white past that didn't yet have the language for personal identity. And in doing that, the film reminded its audience just how far they'd come and how much power they suddenly had to define their own story. And it wasn't just Americans watching. Back to the Future helped sell the image of 1980s America to the rest of the world. Loud, fast, stylish, and filled with possibility. Marty's denim, his music, the DeLorean, they became shorthand for something aspirational, a kind of freedom, a kind of cool. For international audiences, this wasn't just a time travel fantasy, it was a pop culture postcard from the future they wanted to be proud of. And there's something deeper too. Back to the Future isn't just about when Marty is, it's about where he is. Hill Valley becomes a character in itself, a small town microcosm of America, shaped by the values and aesthetics of each decade. Marty returns to the same place, but it feels like a different planet. The town square, the diner, the school, they've all changed, or in some cases, haven't changed enough. The past and present coexist in physical space. It's a reminder that time travel isn't just about dates, it's about identity, culture, and how place defines us. At its core, Back to the Future is a film about families and the strange, sometimes painful process of seeing your parents not as authority figures, but as flawed, uncertain people, just like me and you. Marty's trip to 1955 doesn't just risk his future, it reshapes his understanding of the past. He sees his parents at a time when they're still forming, still finding themselves. And what he discovers isn't inspiring. George is timid and passive, Lorraine drinks and smokes. Their marriage, in 1985, is dull and worn out. Marty realizes that the life he knows is built on compromises, and that, maybe, he doesn't have to be that way. This is where the film hits something deeper than just time travel hijinks. There's a universal fantasy at play. What if you could go back and fix your parents? What if you could help them somehow become braver, more confident, more alive? What if by changing their story, you could change your own? And this is where the 1950s setting matters again, because it was the birth of the teenager as a cultural identity. Post-war prosperity gave young people money, music, and independence. That idea was crystallized in films like George Lucas's American Graffiti, a loving, nostalgic portrait of 1950s youth cruising the strip. Back to the Future taps into that same moment, but with a twist. Instead of watching the team dream unfold, Marty becomes part of it. He's a catalyst, a glitch in the system, and his actions, from teaching George to stand up to Biff, to rocking out at the Enchantment Under the Sea dance, shapes the adults his parents become. And there's irony in that too. Many of us, the audience now in our 30s, 40s and 50s, first saw this film as kids. We were drawn in by the skateboards, the music, the time machine, but we watched it again as teenagers, then again as adults, and each time it made more sense. At first it was all about the fun, But later we started noticing the parents, the compromises, the quiet sadness in the McFly home, and suddenly it wasn't just Marty's story, it was ours too. That's part of what gives the film its emotional staying power. It isn't just about going back in time, it's about looking at the people who raised you and asking, who were they, really? And what does that say about me? So here's the big question. If Back to the Future were pitched today, would it get made? Would it even work? In some ways, absolutely. The concept is solid gold. Time travel, personal stakes, cultural collisions. That stuff never gets old. A kid accidentally prevents his parents from getting together and risks erasing his own existence. It's a killer hook. Studios would love that pitch. But in other ways, it's a much harder sell now. For one, it's surprisingly intimate. The stakes are personal, not global. There's no villain threatening the world, no ticking bomb in the sky. The film spends more time in school hallways and awkward family dinners than it does in big action set pieces. A studio exec today might say, can we add more spectacle? Or worse, can we make it a multiverse? Then there's the tone. Back to the Future walks a very delicate line. It's funny, but never goofy. It's sentimental, but never saccharine. And it touches some complicated material. Sexual assault, bullying, alcoholism, all presented in ways that would likely be heavily scrutinized today. Studios might hesitate, unsure if the tone is safe. But part of the reason the film works is because it doesn't flinch. It trusts the audience to follow. There's also the question of originality. In the age of remakes, sequels, and IP-driven everything, would a brand new story like this, not based on a comic, game, or toy, get the same green light it did in 1985? Maybe. But it would probably need to be packaged with a star, a franchise, or an algorithm's blessing. And there's something else. The cultural contrast. Leah Thompson, who played Lorraine, once pointed out that if Back to the Future were made today and the characters went back 30 years, they'd land in 1995. And according to her, nothing would look that different. And she's right. The reason the film worked in 1985 is because the world of 1955 felt like another planet. From clothes to music to gender roles, in a modern reboot, you'd lose that tension. You'd lose that strangeness. Then again, maybe the deeper question isn't would it work today, is why does it still work now? And the answer lies in its heart. Back to the Future isn't about tech or plot twists. It's about identity. It's about family. It's about wanting to matter, to make your mark, and wondering if you've inherited the limits of the people who raised you. That's timeless. And ironically, in our current moment of digital overload and franchise fatigue, a film like this might feel refreshing. No spandex, no shared universe, just one kid, one car, and one shot to get it right. So no, maybe it wouldn't work if it were pitched today, but if it landed today, if it somehow snuck through the cracks and appeared in your Netflix feed, you'd watch it, you'd tell your friends, and you'd probably wish more films were like it. There's a reason Back to the Future still gets referenced, rewatched, and celebrated 40 years on. And it's not just nostalgia. The film has become part of the cultural language. The DeLorean, Great Scott, the hoverboard, the clock tower, even people who haven't seen the movie know the references. It's not just a film, it's shorthand for an entire genre of storytelling. Fun, smart, self-aware, and heartfelt. But unlike many of the franchises that followed, Back to the Future never overstayed its welcome. It told its story across 3 films and then, mostly, left it alone. No gritty reboot, no prequel spin-offs, no bloated cinematic universe. that restraint has only deepened the affection people have for it. It belongs to a different era of filmmaking, one where story came first and success didn't automatically mean endless replication. And for those of us who grew up with it, watching it as kids, re-watching it as teenagers, quoting it as adults, it's more than a movie. It's a touchstone, a way of remembering how the world used to feel, full of invention, possibility, and just enough danger. Watching Back to the Future again now, you realise how much it gave us. A cinematic experience that was tight, inventive, emotional, and somehow effortlessly cool. It's also, in a strange way, a film about hope. Things can change. The past doesn't have to define you. Your parents weren't perfect, but maybe they were doing their best. And you? You might have more power over your future than you think. And yes, it's a fantasy. Real life doesn't let you rewrite your own origin story by punching a bully at a high school dance. But as fantasies go, this one has weight. It speaks to something universal, our desire to understand where we came from and to believe we can still shape where we are going. For me personally, it's more than just a great film. As I mentioned previously, I wrote an essay on Back to the Future while studying at university, exploring its postmodern layers, its use of nostalgia, and how it plays with the idea of authorship and agency. And now, decades later, I'm returning to it with a podcast, reflecting on its themes and timing and recognizing just how much it helped shape my understanding of cinema. 40 years on, Back to the Future is still a miracle of tone, concept, and execution. It's 88 miles per hour, and where we are going, we don't need roads. Thank you for listening to this special edition of Movie Shorts. If you like this episode, then be sure to leave a rating and review this podcast. Follow me on Instagram at MovieShortsAndyMac. And until next time, goodbye.